Monday. Kara Oosterhouse with RealAgriculture.com here. We are back here today with a RealAg Live. I don't know about you. I am in Southern Alberta. It is very cold across the prairies right now, and I hope you all are staying warm. But I'm just happy to have you guys here. It's a little bit of warmth in my day. So keep the comments coming, whether you're watching on Twitch, YouTube, Twitter, or Facebook. Feel free, put your comments in the comments section and we will get to them right away. And on the note of weather, I'm going to bring in today's guest. Today's guest is actually Eric Snodgrass, and he is a principal atmospheric scientist with Nutrien Ag Solutions. How's it going today?
You know, it's cold here too, but I'm happy to be in a nice warm room and get to chit chat with you today about the weather from the shelter of a house, not out there in the elements.
Yeah, no kidding. That's exactly. We can complain all we want, but we're not, I especially feel for those cattle producers today that are out and checking cows and feeding cows and doing all the bedding right now because I'm like, ooh, it's a good day to be in ag media inside for sure. Um, so today, like I said, we're here to talk about weather. What sort of trends are you seeing this year? Let's start first on in Western Canada. What sort of trends are you seeing?
Well, you know, the beginning of this winter was kind of boring. It really didn't do what we thought it was going to do, which was we had a La Nina brewing in the Pacific, and generally that tends to bring in a lot of cold air that comes out of British Columbia, through Alberta, through Saskatchewan, over to Manitoba, and we tend to get a lot of cold air early in this season that lasts through much of winter, and we just didn't see it. You go back to much of December and January, we had a mild pattern. So that's been one surprise that I think has hit a lot of us so far this year, that the cold really just started to come on here now that we got into the month of February. I mean, the real cold, the stuff where we're seeing these minus 30, minus 40 degree temperatures, and the wind chill is much colder than that. And it's been interesting because we had a split in the polar vortex, and normally that's that sends off all the bells and whistles to look out for brutal cold. But guess where it went? It went to Siberia and Kazakhstan and China first. It's dear sweet time coming around. So I think that's been the biggest surprise to start the season. And we'll have to see how long this cold, now that it's here, lasts for.
But there is something about February, I think. It just seems to always be January can be a bit of a toss up, but February seems to always be cold, especially across the prairies. So I don't know how many of us are too surprised, but there has been a bit of a lack of moisture in the prairies. I mean, like especially Western North America is really dry right now. What are we anticipating for moisture? Can farmers have any hope of seeing any precipitation this year?
Well, you know what's strange about drought in winter in the western half of North America and the Canadian prairie is that we typically don't make any changes at all to our drought profile or anything, because the soil freezes over. So we just can't get moisture into it in the first place. We have to wait till the spring melt, and we've got to get a good mountain snowpack in order to make a big dent in that. So looking across, the U.S., we still have 60% of the lower 48 in drought. And it's extensive across our four corner states. It stretches into the northern plains of the U.S., so think North, South Dakota, Montana, and then that extends into parts of the southern Canadian prairie. And looking at some satellite data, we could tell that probably the place that seems to be the driest right now gets over into parts of southern Saskatchewan, but then really into southern Manitoba. And that's an area where we're going to have to wait for some melt of snow and then the spring thaw and hopefully some good early rains just to bring that moisture profile back up. So yes, we're very dry, and about the only place that's made any sort of progress this year on the drought situation for us in the States has been parts of Washington State, a little bit in Oregon. California's hurting pretty bad. They had just one decent week of onshore flow that helped bring them out of a major snow deficit. I mean, it's amazing. Parts of the Sierra Nevada mountains got over 120 inches of snow in about a 5-day stretch. But that's just not enough to correct the longer term problems. So through the Corn Belt, through the southern plains, the central plains, and northern plains of the US, we are very concerned about what this means going into spring. And then it extends into the Canadian prairie, where we know the drier conditions exist.
Absolutely. And in the Canadian prairies, we still we get a lot of, especially I was talking to a fertilizer market analyst a couple weeks ago, and he was talking about the Mississippi and how it's there's real concern there this year. Is there any hope for snowpack that up there that could actually bring some moisture into the Mississippi?
You know what's strange this year is that there's been a bit of a snow drought at the headwaters of both the Missouri and the Mississippi River. So we continue to send systems to the south of it. I mean, I have seen so many huge snowstorms in northern Texas and Oklahoma that go over to like the Washington D.C. and the Northeast, and they just keep kind of going around the Great Lakes. They keep going around the northern plains. And if we don't start filling that in, there are places in North Dakota, just looking at some data from the US here, that are sitting like 20 to 25 inches below where they should be so far this year with snow. And we start to get concerned that if that doesn't fill in, well, where's the moisture going to come from in spring when the melt is supposed to happen to help that out? And, at this point, with the really cold air that's here in February, that cold air is super dry. I mean, it's a cool thing we teach our students at the 100 level at the university. The colder you make the air, the less moisture it can contain. So automatically it's dry when it's this cold. And we've just pushed that snow line farther and farther to the south. And for example, this whole week across the states, it's going to go from Colorado through Oklahoma, what we call the Ohio River Valley, toward Washington, D.C. again, giving them all the snow, leaving the northern plains and the Canadian prairie kind of high and dry. Literally, I mean, the pressure will be something like 1,050 millibars, which is, that's approaching the very tail of the distribution in terms of how high the pressure can get. So you're right. We got to watch the headwaters of those major river systems. It's going to be critical for what spring moisture profile will look like. And right now, things are missing.
Yeah, and you start talking dry and cold winter or cold air, and you're gonna have all the Ontario and the prairies people coming at each other because it seems like we're always complaining in the prairies about the cold, and they're like, "Yeah, but it's not a wet cold, you guys. It is not the same." But on that note, moving into Ontario, last year they really seen a late start to spring. It was very cool in May. Any predictions on what spring could look like in Ontario?
Well, if we rewind the clock just a moment, Ontario missed out on a lot of early snow, especially that spot right just to the east of Lake Huron. So we think about this region as getting decent amounts of lake effect snow. Well, we had barely any because there was just no cold air in December, even November, December, and January. Well, it's come back on lately, which is good. And as the lakes freeze over, because remember, this time of year, they should be at about 50 to 55% frozen over. And they were, gosh, I checked the numbers last week, they were about 15% frozen over. That's going to be critical for their upcoming spring pattern. You're right, though. What ended up happening in and around all of the Great Lake states, the Great Lake Basin, that whole area, was that we had this time period where we were able to kind of jump at getting a crop in, and then it backed off cool. It backed off with a little bit too much moisture at time. And then we look at this other factor called, solar radiation. But when we look at the solar flux, it turned out it was quite cloudy. So nothing really jumped out of the ground and got the season going in that whole region. I'm talking from Iowa clear to Ontario. That whole pocket was really missing out on the best start to the growing season. So when we look at this upcoming March, if I based my forecast off of what was kind of shown to us over the weekend, we have some brand new long range model updates. They're trying to bring in warmth back into, all the way from Arizona in the southwest of the US, clear to the Canadian Maritimes, and that cuts right through Ontario, Quebec, that whole region, trying to keep some warmer conditions around. And unfortunately, that means they're going to keep the cold back from Alberta to Saskatchewan as we go into the early part of spring. But so you base it on those things, and the models are saying, hey, let's go after some warmth and a good jump start on the growing season. But you know what? If those models were 100% accurate, I wouldn't have a job, and nor would I be able to tell you about other factors that could influence it. So yeah, it's going to be something that we'll have to, I think, get past this brutal cold time period in February before we can make an accurate assessment as to what their spring pattern might look like.
And I mean, like you said, it is difficult to make these predictions so early, but is there any indication of what sort of precipitation might be around in spring? I mean, in Eastern Canada, because I know there's been, what year was it, 2018 or 19, when it was so wet and farmers could not get anything in the ground. So are we looking at one of those years, or what kind of planting conditions can we maybe look at?
So what happened in 2019 when it was so wet, where in the Corn Belt through the Great Lake Basin, we saw the highest frequency of rainfall events. In other words, the most number of them from March all the way through June. What happened was we had southwest flow in the jet stream. So just imagine the jet stream starting in Hawaii, cutting across California, going straight to Ontario. And in that particular setup, just system after system rolled through the central part of North America and just wouldn't stop. And we had the latest planted crop here in the US on record. Southwest flow. Now, this year, we've not seen a hint of southwest flow. That's why California is in drought. It's all been flow that's been coming more from the west and even at times from the northwest. And you're not going to be bringing in moisture from either of those directions. It's got to come out of the warm Pacific, or it's got to come out of the Gulf of Mexico and get pulled together and head up toward the Great Lakes Basin. And so those are the things we're going to have to watch to see if they happen. So until I start to see some sort of signal that says pull the air out of the southwest, bring in the moisture-laden air from the Pacific and the Atlantic and the Gulf and smack them together kind of over the Great Lakes Basin, then there's no reason to say that we're going to go over to an overly wet spring. But then again, in years like 2019, we didn't really see that signal pop out until March. And like you asked me earlier, when it popped out in March, it hit the headwaters of the Missouri, the headwaters of the Mississippi first, and they continued to push over toward the Great Lake Basin into Ontario. And those kind of things, as they began to set up during that time period, brought us onto this incredibly wet spring back in 2019.
So earlier you were talking about La Nina. We wouldn't be talking weather if we did not mention La Nina at least once. Do you want to talk about what sort of patterns it's bringing this year and how that could impact Canada and the US, of course?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we think of La Nina, what we often think about is that the La Nina is an effective mechanism to just steal the momentum out of the atmosphere. Okay, so normally when the jet stream is just screaming out of the west toward the east, we get regular snowstorms in winter. We get regular shots at both warm and cold air, and the pattern really resists getting stuck in one configuration or the other. So that's what La Ninas are good for. They're good for stealing the fun out of the atmosphere and letting it just get stuck. So just to think about this, back in 18 and 19, we didn't have a La Nina. In fact, we didn't have an El Nino either. And what do we end up getting? More routine, regular weather systems, albeit extreme, during that spring. But go back to last year when the La Nina was developing in 2020. Look at the Western US wildfires. We burned 8.2 million acres. We had a wide open door for tropical cyclones to come into the southeast, and we had 30 named tropical systems that smashed a record for the for the Atlantic Basin. So this La Nina is fading, like they do. The La Nina typically reaches a peak, and so does El Nino, right around the turn of the new year. And we just have to see if the current La Nina is going to kick and scream its way out or just kind of fade out. Now, one of the things that I'm watching to get to your question here is La Ninas sometimes have an extension, not just across the central Pacific, which is where they're typically confined, but sometimes they have an extension of cooler water that goes up toward the Baja of California, goes up to the west coast of the United States, and even curls into the Gulf of Alaska. Now, if we get a lot of cool water extending off of the southwestern coast of the United States and some cool water emerging in the Gulf of Alaska, that is one of the best pre-season signals that the Central Plains, the Canadian Prairie, the Corn Belt, the Great Lake Basin has increased risk of drought. And the reason why is if there's cool water along the west coast, it kind of sensibly cools the atmosphere, producing more troughs west and more ridges in the central part of North America. And what those ridges end up doing is they produce high pressure, and the high pressure tends to block the moisture transport from both the Gulf of Mexico and from the Pacific Ocean. So what you end up getting is La Ninas have a higher instance, a higher rate of giving us that pattern. Usually in winter, I'm almost always just saying, wait a second, let's not talk too much about spring moisture yet. Let's not talk too much about spring moisture yet, because we know that spring rains can undo all of winter's sins, right? You could miss out on everything, and then it all comes back in winter, and it's a fantastic start to the growing season. This is one of those years where if I start off at a 50-50, where I'm worrying about drought, I think this year I'm more like 60-40, because of the two things I told you. No southwest flow, and that La Nina just tends to give us signals that are stronger toward pointing toward drought. And I'm going to be honest, I hope beyond hope that I'm wrong. Meteorologists, we do a little wish casting from now and again, and I'm telling you, I hope that I'm wrong about this upcoming growing season, because I do not want to see risk of fire in the western half of North America, and I don't want to see a big ridge parked between, let's put it, Wisconsin to Minnesota to Manitoba over to Ontario. That is the most feared weather pattern I have for summer for this section of the country.
Yeah, well, like you said, I hope it stays away, but it's, I guess, good to be maybe a little mentally prepared for what could happen for sure. Now, of course, we're going to watch what's going on in our own backyard, but part of being a farmer is we're watching markets right now this time of year, and part of that is looking at South America. Do you want to talk about what's
Mhm.
going on right now in South America, and is there any hope for some rain there, or is the crop it's having a tough year there too?
It is, but what's strange about South America? Let me give you a statistic to put this into context. So right now, Brazil only farms about 8% of its arable land, and therefore it has massive acres from which it can expand into growing more crops. And they primarily are growing, some sugarcane, but a lot of cotton, a lot of corn, and a lot of soybeans. Now, where they're getting their new acreage, this is kind of a bit of a misnomer. A lot of folks think they're burning into the Amazon. And yes, that happened back in the 70s and 80s. But most of their new acreage comes from converting pasture land over to, growing crops. Okay. One of the bits of research that I spent a lot of my summer trying to figure out was they have very, very tight planting and harvesting winters because they double crop. They typically go after a big first crop of soybeans, followed by what they call a safrina, or second crop of corn and cotton. All right, what the research told me was that in October, which is the end of their dry season and the beginning of the monsoon, that October precipitation patterns are getting drier and drier over the last 40 years. So this is kind of tightening up the window in which they get that first crop in. So I'm telling you this because this year, those rains didn't arrive in late September, early October, and put them about 2, in some places 3 weeks off the pace in getting the first crop of soybeans in. Since then, it's been the driest in Mato Grosso. That's a northern growing area. It's been the driest there in 40 years. But understand something. Dry in Mato Grosso, they still get 1 to 4 inches of rain a week. I mean, it's dry and they're still getting 2 inches of rain a week, which means the crop is probably doing okay. The problem is that some of that crop was planted into less than ideal conditions and had a horrible start, and you're starting to see the yield come off from it. Now they're 15 to 20 days late in harvesting it, and they're at the slowest harvest pace in a decade, which means the safrina crop, which is corn and cotton, is also going to go in late. So North American export markets are covering that gap, and that's why we've seen some weather support, and there's a whole bunch of other reasons for the support of high prices, but the weather support in the markets. Now, it's been very wet south in southern Brazil. It's also been very, very wet in pockets of Argentina. But my concern moving forward, tying this back to La Nina, is the second half of the growing season tends to be very dry in Argentina when there's a La Nina. Fading or otherwise, it tends to be drier there. And I'm going to have to watch it carefully because that full season crop that's grown there, mostly a corn and soybean crop, could have some problems as we go toward grain fill here in the next month or so. So Brazil is going to be a wild card. And as we see the harvest now, and the second harvest again in April, it'll really tell us what to expect out of the North American market to make up for deficits. It's going to be an important year where we're watching those balance sheets really closely.
And staying on the global scheme here, Phil Shaw is asking a question. Is very interesting, I think. He says, "How about volcanoes in Asia? Do they have any effect on North American crop weather?"
That's a good question. Big ones do. When we have large volcanic eruptions, they can disrupt global weather patterns. They can also keep a lot of ash and soot and debris into the stratosphere. I'm looking at it right now. It's 10 miles above my head, but up there, they put a lot of stuff in the atmosphere. And it can have an effect where it tends to block a little bit of sunlight. And we can measure that at the surface as a reduced amount of solar radiation that would be getting down that the plant could use that's no longer there. Do they influence the trough ridge pattern, the flow of the jet stream? To be honest, I don't think that there's solid evidence that some of the smaller eruptions do, but I mean, if I pull out some big names here like Pinatubo or St. Helens, those kind of events do often have long-standing consequences in the flow of the atmosphere that can last in sometimes upwards of a year to maybe two. But yeah, it's more about what it's putting into the upper levels of the atmosphere and the stratosphere that really tend to impact how the weather patterns might shift and might reduce total amount of insolation or sunlight getting to the surface. That's a great question.
Yeah, we definitely have some really interesting listeners that follow follow climate and weather very closely. So, do you want to comment on any sort of anomalies? Is what I'm looking for that we might be kind of anticipating this year in Canada?
You know, the first one is going to be how low the soil moisture is in parts of Manitoba. It's hard to overcome drought when you start off with it. Secondly, the fact that it's dry south of there in the northern plains means that any moisture return from the Gulf of Mexico, and yeah, it makes it clear to like Highway 16, right? If we don't get that drought undone early, just imagine that you got this really moist air that's going to run over the top of that really dry air at the surface. It's going to zap any moisture out of it, which I don't like. So those are a couple of anomalous things to worry about. Outside of that, the big anomalies I'm going to care about are going to be in ocean temperatures in the Pacific. And I think that is going to be the most significant departure from normal. You could make a few comments about the sea ice situation across the Arctic, but I think those are already played out in the jet stream pattern and in the disruption of the polar vortex we saw back in January. So other than those things, until we start to see how the spring pattern sets up, it's going to be those things combined with the lack of southwest flow that I'll be most concerned about.
So when we're looking at the year ahead, of course, you can't help but look at previous years. Now we're looking into 2021. Is there any year comparison that you would compare it to?
I spent the morning, I start on Mondays very early. My workday starts at 2 a.m. And I spent about 2 hours this morning searching for what we call analogs. That's what you're referring to. Analog years that look similar to this. And I was focused initially on La Nina. Now, I'm going to say a year, but I don't want people on this call or people listening in to keep this too tightly in mind, because what's interesting is the behavior of the pressure patterns and therefore the winds look very similar to what happened from 2007 going into 2008. But what doesn't look the same is the rest of the ocean pattern across the globe. It's much, much different. We have another feature that I'm watching very carefully too, that I cannot find an analog for. We watch the upper level winds constantly. And there's a thing called the QBO, the quasi-biennial oscillation. Now, for the sake of nerd speak, it's just we watch the way that the winds kind of circumnavigate around the equator, but about 15 miles above our heads. Turns out that they really affect the momentum of the atmosphere as well. And there's not a single year I can look back on. And we've got data from that for like 70 years. I can't find a year that looks similar to what we've got going on this year. So I'm struggling to find good analog years to this year. The latest forecasts make it look just like a year ago in March, but I don't know why. I look at those models and say, why in the world would you forecast warmth where you're forecasting it? Because the setup is entirely different than we had a year ago. So it is always valuable to find years that are similar. And this is one where if we try to pick out one year and say that it looks most like that year, it's going to fall disastrously short on coming true and coming into any sort of fruition. I have to get past what I call the spring barrier before I make a really confident call as to what the remainder of spring and summer is going to look like. And that's basically once we get past the coldest time of year, which we're probably in right now, and really see what the North Pacific is going to give us in terms of a jet stream. I'll remind you of something important here, and that is weather forecasting skill beyond about 15 days drops off dramatically. And because of that, it's speculative to look out farther than that. And if you want proof that it's speculative, notice how there's no billionaire meteorologists out there, okay? Because if we could really predict it, oh my goodness, it would be, I'd make two trades, one on the grain markets, one on the energy markets, and then we would be done. I would be in great shape I'd buy that little island I've had my eye on in the Caribbean here for a number of years. So that's the way it is.
I mean, if we could predict things, I think the whole world would be a little different for sure.
Absolutely.
Chris has a really good question here. He says, what are the long range forecasts for Atlantic Canada? Now, obviously, this is, like you said, you can't predict that far, but what sort of trends are you expecting in Atlantic Canada?
So they're stuck on warm. And the reason why is because we've built throughout early this winter a big ridge into Greenland. And so with that, it has at times let that ridge go over toward the Hudson Bay. And if the ridge, again, a ridge is just where the jet stream bulges north, it only does that because there's warmth inside of it and underneath it. And so I look out there at that time period and it just wants to keep it. Now, I do realize we have had some brutal winter storms that have swept through during all of that. But at the same time, they just can't let go of that pattern. And when you think about places on Earth that are the most challenging to forecast, it is that side of Canada. And it's because you're at this intersection where you're bound between the Hudson Bay, Greenland, and what is the warm North Atlantic coming off of the Gulf Stream. And to us in atmospheric sciences, we call this a great region to watch for something called baroclinicity. Sorry, I'm going a little nerdy on you today, but that's basically where your pressure lines and your temperature lines crisscross. And the atmosphere just wants to crank up and spin up, which means rapid transition in those kind of scenarios. And so at this point, I wouldn't trust a long range model with anything looking out on that side of Canada, Eastern Canada here into the near future. Once again, I need to see what happens with the North Atlantic, if it's going to break down that big ridge, which, by the way, if you listen to us meteorologists talk about it all the time, what we call that is the negative phase of the North Atlantic Oscillation, the negative NAO. If that crumbles and falls apart, you're going to go into an entirely different regime for the rest of winter and start of spring. And no one right now has any idea if that's going to happen.
No. Is there anything else you're watching that producers should be? I mean, of course, you're always watching a gazillion different things. As you said, you start your morning at 2 a.m. That is, you must be looking at a few different things. Is there anything of note that we haven't talked about that you'd really like to, add?
Yeah, I think there's something I would like to add about long-term trends. Okay. So I study this because I'm ultimately trying to understand how are producers shifting practices to take advantage of or to adapt to longer term trends. And essentially, one of the big trends that I think is most important for us in, let's just call it the ag belt of North America.
Yep.
When you look east of the Rocky Mountains, that's the ag belt I'm talking about. So this does not apply to the west. The east of the Rocky Mountains, we are seeing that in spring, over the last 70 years, there has been an increase in precipitation frequency. And I've really studied this inside of the primary corn and soybean belt to learn that we're also seeing, in fact, my home state of Illinois, we've almost tripled the frequency of our 2-inch rainfall events in a 24-hour time period per year. So in other words, the number of times it rains more than 2 inches in a single day has tripled over the last 40 years. So what we've noticed is that the precipitation is being delivered in more intense big bursts, followed by longer stretches of drier weather. So my big research program this year has been to study a lot more about flash drought in relationship with flash flooding, because the statistics would suggest that while we are actually getting wetter in the main ag belt, the delivery of the rainfall is changing. Now, one of the ways by which we've been making adjustments to prepare for this is with tech. I mean, we have bigger and badder planners that can go in and do stuff right when we need to, and the windows open up and get the work done. But it means that water management is going to be key to success of our future cropping efforts right here in the breadbasket of North America. And I want people that are listening to always be thinking about looking at the data, looking at the statistics, and understanding how can we make strategic investments in order to continue to be sustainable, resilient, and profitable, knowing that weather every year is going to give us risk, but there's this longer term trend toward greater variability in our water resource. So I think about that with this upcoming spring. I think about that last year. I mean, we had a great start to the growing season in the Corn Belt. And in the middle of it, in July and August, a massive flash drought that made Nebraska and Iowa and Northern Illinois all have one of their driest Augusts on record. And it was punctuated by a huge derecho event that came through and knocked down all our corn and soybeans, but gave everything a huge drink of water. That kind of change is something we're used to, but we need to know that it's increasing in frequency. And I would like people just to know that I'm studying that and trying to understand what that's going to do to productivity. So far, it's been beneficial, but we got to learn to manage the water, I think, just better and better. And that's what our crop scientists, that's what our the agronomists, that's what the people who study the soil are good at. I'll tell you what the weather's doing. We need to figure out together how it's going to be used as an information source to continue to become more and more productive. Because I'll tell you, the world is watching North America and our productivity into the future as probably the primary source of food, fiber, and fuel moving forward.
Yeah, and I know when you say, well, the world is watching North America, I think they really are right now, and I know we got a bunch of viewers right now that are commenting across the prairies, especially on this drought. Is there any insight on, besides water management, what sorts of things are you guys finding that producers can be doing to kind of stay ahead of this? Because if it's looking like it's going to be another dry year, this for some is multiple years in a row.
Yeah, some of that's going to come down to seed selection. I mean, if there's the option, if we're concerned about drought, so this is purely in the context of I'm concerned about my soil moisture. What do I do? I know that we're in February, and therefore this time of year with respect to seed selection, well, some of those decisions have been made. But I would be looking at all of the extension research done at university and well, what are my best options in terms of choosing a seed that's going to be able to handle possibly some water stresses. But then at the same time, if the rains return, that same seed is going to be able to produce a great crop for me. I'd be thinking about what it would mean to purchase the right insurance, maybe a multi-peril insurance package, just to make sure that if I lose a crop due to drought, or if I lose it to hail, or I mean, my goodness, did Canada have hail this past year?
Yep.
I'm a storm chaser just as a hobby, and I was watching some of the Canadian storms. Now, don't get me wrong, I was jealous just because I love to watch them. I know they were damaging and destructive, but my goodness, you had some beautiful storms this past year. Well, we need to be thinking about that as well, because you can have a year where you're in drought and have a field destroyed by hail at the same time. So, those would be the couple of things I would be thinking about. Now, longer term, thinking about future drought stress or water management stress, the solution in my home state of Illinois has been every field through here is pattern tile. And what they're also doing is they're putting in really cool systems that they call them saturated buffers. And it's a neat thing. I'll take 2 seconds to describe it. When the tile drains out of the field, okay, usually goes into a waterway or a ditch and just leaves. What they're now doing is they're redirecting that water to go into a piece of tile, a big one, a 12-inch piece of tile that runs along the field boundaries into the buffer. Might be next to the road, might be next to the ditch, doesn't matter. And what they're doing is when there's excess water, they're filling up that buffer, saturating that ground as well with this little lock and dam system. Now, when you get that filled, you got to let what's left over go. But it prevents nutrient loss. And then it can actually be opened to allow water to trickle back in through the tile should your field get dry and your buffer have water saturated in it. And it's this brilliant, setup to really help a farmer manage water when they got too much and then do something when they don't have enough. There are all sorts of techniques like that, but it basically comes down to soil tilt, soil health, and making sure that you're doing the things that allow your soil to have the right texture so that when water's there, it keeps it, doesn't let it get back into the atmosphere or blow away or anything like that. So that was a very long-winded answer to your short question, but those are the things I'm watching most carefully when I think about this water management issue.
Absolutely, and it's one of those things that you have to watch. As farmers, we rely on Mother Nature, we really do. So you have to learn to be a little bit adaptive for sure. And Paul's just commenting. He says, "Beautiful storms. This guy's a weather nerd. Love the info." So you're getting you're getting lots of great comments. I know nobody really loves the storms that come in, but I mean I grew up on a farm in the prairie, so it was that 2 a.m. Thunder would roll in, you'd hear it, and we'd all be up on the deck watching it. Like that was
Oh
just
yeah.
what happened, right? Like even if you're like, no, we cannot afford to be wiped out, you are still watching those clouds come in because they are some storms. So it's not just you. Don't worry about that. But thank you very much. We are unfortunately out of time. This has been a fascinating talk. I was just thinking, I don't know if I've ever heard anyone describe El Nino quite as great as you did.
Good.
I will be curious to hear if El Nino is something that leaves with kicking and screaming or leaves peacefully. So we'll be we'll be watching that closely. But thank you very much for your time. It is always wonderful to be able to chat weather whenever we can.
All right. Thank you so much.
And thank you for all that commented. I just love seeing all your comments come in and the little side conversations that are going on, and all your questions. You guys got some great questions. So thank you very much. I appreciate your time and appreciate you tuning in to Real Agriculture. We try and bring you the best content as often as we possibly can. So thank you very much. And we will talk to you guys tomorrow. I'm not sure who is on the show as of tomorrow yet, but I believe Sean will be your host. So tune in at 1 p.m. Mountain to get the next Real Ag Live. And in the meantime, tonight, join into the agronomist. Host Lindsay Smith will be, I believe she has Robin Bones Davidson of Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, as well as Kelly Turkington of Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. So they'll be talking all things pulse and cereal diseases, I believe. So that'll be a great one to check out for sure. That is also on Facebook, Twitter, Twitch, or YouTube. And in the meantime, thanks everyone for getting real and getting connected with Real Agriculture.